be Matt. Yeah. Hey, Marty. Go get it and come up. Hey, I'm Andrew. Yeah. It's this. I think we just had forward, so it might be. All right, we're going to hear from our last presentation, our last presenter for the morning before we go into lunch. Matt Smith is the Director of Commodity Research at ClipperData. He specializes in extracting key themes from technical and fundamental analysis of the global energy market and communicating these themes through daily and weekly deliverables. He provides oil and natural gas analysis and commentary to national and international media outlets that include CNBC, Fox Business, the Wall Street Journal, Market Watch, AFP, Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Oil Daily. Prior to joining ClipperData, he worked for 8 years at Schneider Electric Summit Energy as a global commodity analyst, where he also founded and authored the blog Energy Burrito. He started his career at the Royal Bank of Canada in the United Kingdom, spending 8 years with the bank. During that time, he managed $55 million in assets as a portfolio manager and financial analyst. Matt's presentation is Preposterous Petroleum, a voyage across the energy landscape. So Matt, turn it over to you.
Okay, good morning everybody. All right, I'm very, very excited to be here. It's really nice to be actually in Kentucky and speaking. I'm based in Louisville, and ClipperData is based in Louisville as well, or at least my job is, but I kind of, I feel like I could work for the tourist board, because essentially I've moved over here from London. I got dragged over here by my wife some 9 years ago, and I think Kentucky is brilliant. I absolutely love the place, and so I'm really happy to be speaking here rather than speaking in some random other place in the US or that, and kind of having to champion Kentucky. That bit is already done, so that's great. So what I'm going to do is talk about Preposterous Petroleum today, and not a journey through across the energy landscape. I'm going to do two different bits. I know you're going to get bombarded the next couple of days in terms of oil and gas, and so I'm going to look at other stuff as well. So we're going to take a little look at sort of nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, absolutely everything. We'll touch on it all, okay? So that is the plan. Before I do that, I'll just explain a little bit about ClipperData. And so I also write a blog now called ClipperBlog. So if you go to clipperdata.com, ClipperBlog is up there. And so out on there, I get to muse about market stuff that's going on. ClipperData is this company that tracks ships all over the world. So it's fantastic. I've only been there about sort of 6-7 weeks, something like that. But what I can do, I'll show you what we look at. We track all ships around the world. We can see where different flows are going, refined product, crude, etc. And so we can really get to the granular detail and see what's going on. And so in terms of, say, Saudi Arabian exports, people will say, oh, they're taking over global market share. I say that's poppycock, because I can see waterborne exports here and not see it dropping. And so that's a very, very exciting thing from my perspective, and I'll try and highlight some of the kind of like little secrets I've learned along the way recently. So what we're going to do is we are going to look at the economy, because I think that energy affects everything, and all paths lead back to energy. All these things are interlinked. Then we're going to look at the oil market, and then from there we're going to transition into this sort of look at the global energy landscape across these other different commodities. So if we just start off with the economy, everything is going a bit Van Halen. I keep saying this, and I will keep saying it until it's not true. Every economic indicator I look at reminds me of the Van Halen logo. For example, this is job creation in the US here. So what this is back in 2005, I really need a ladder if we have one. See what this is, job creation, it dipped the belly of the Great Recession in sort of 2009, March there. We were losing 800,000 jobs here in the US. We have recovered, now we're seeing about 200,000 jobs created every month. Good, but not fantastic. This reflects through to manufacturing. Anything above sort of 50 is expansion, anything below is contraction. We're above 50, but nothing too great. Again, that absolutely tanking in the Great Recession there, rebounded, but nothing fantastic. All this comes through to economic growth there. So we see that the dip in the Van Halen logo there, boom, belly of the Great Recession, and now we're kind of ticking along, 2-3%, something like that. So good, but not fantastic. Everything's still going a little bit Van Halen. But in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And I say that because that's basically what we are here in the US, because even though we may not be doing fantastically, compared to other economies in the world, we are doing great. See, this is the pro-American coming out in me here. And so I'll highlight, as I said, all paths lead back to energy. You can see this just here through with Russia. So Russia gets 75% of its exports are oil and gas. Sort of 50% of its budget is based on that. So when you see such an oil price drop, their economy is getting absolutely crushed versus expectations at the beginning of last year. Then at the top there you see China's doing okay, but China's going through this process where it's moving from being an export-driven economy to now being more driven by domestic demand. So people are buying their first phone, their first refrigerator. Actually, cars over there, through May of this year, SUV sales were up 50% year on year. And they're going through this strange kind of transition there where previously their oil demand was driven by industrial fuels and industrial output, and now that's kind of at this tipping point where it's gasoline demand that's driving that as people are now being able to afford cars. But I digress, sorry. And then India's doing pretty well there, but the US, you see, is one of the few countries that has been revised up on the prior year, because essentially we still import over 7 million barrels a day of oil. And because we do that, when you see a price that was like at $150 sort of back in June last year, and now we've dropped down to 50, 55, that is a fantastic boom for the US economy. Again, though, you would think that perhaps that the oil drop would have a bigger benefit on some countries, but we're really not seeing it coming through specifically in China there. This is kind of still that slow growth there, although they did come in at 7%. Their GDP just last night was released for the second quarter, so they're just above that 6.8. But Japan's still in trouble, and then Brazil, poor old Brazil there, another country that is highly dependent upon oil, on its oil exports, and because of the drop in price, means a drop in revenues, means a drop in their economy. All right, so that's a quick look at the economy, and if we go on to oil next, so a lot going on in this chart, I realise, but this is the key thing. So the red line is the crude price, right? The blue bars essentially represent OPEC's demand for its oil. So in terms of the global oil market, we consume like sort of 93, 94 million barrels of oil a day. 94 million barrels, right? And so OPEC accounts for about 40% of that. And what they've basically done is tried to balance the market in sort of recent history. So every time this line has kind of got too far down, they've put more supply onto the market. And then once there's been too much demand, they put more supply on the market. Tried to keep it very much balanced. But then you've got to this point over here. It's a good job I've got my health insurance kicked in 2 weeks ago, so jumping across between here. I'll be all right if I twist my ankle, it'll be fine. Just get me to a hospital. Right, you see, what the thing is here is these two big bars over on the right-hand side here. This has basically been when OPEC, and specifically Saudi Arabia, has realized that they just cannot fight off the shale oil boom that is happening here. And so what it said, it's gone like, we've had enough of this. We are just going to put our oil onto the market. We're not going to try and balance it anymore. We're just going to have at it. And so as you can see there, it's 2 million barrels a day oversupplied. And so the last 2 quarters, that's what we've seen. And that's something that is a theme of this year in terms of oil prices, that basically the market is so oversupplied just because OPEC aren't playing ball anymore. Okay, this is what I call my famous Saturday Night Fever chart. Granted, I'm only sort of 5'6", so I'll stand on another chair over here. So this is called the Saturday Night Fever chart because basically US oil production back in sort of early 2012 was at 5 million barrels. Okay, and it went from 5 million barrels and it went up to 9 million barrels, and it's just keeping going like that. And so it's like John Travolta out of Saturday Night Fever. You with me? No, you're not. It works sometimes. Okay, so basically, we are in a modern-day oil boom, though. This is fantastic. And this is really only coming through from 2 key states, North Dakota and then Texas as well, with the Permian and the Eagle Ford basins there. And so just those 3 basins have added sort of nearly 4 million barrels a day in terms of oil in the last few years. And that is your Saturday Night Fever chart. Please remember that. So in terms of the rest of supply, you have OPEC supply, which we looked at that other chart, and non-OPEC supply. And basically, as you can see from this, no one is bringing growth from anywhere. No, poor old Blighty over here, poor old United Kingdom, not doing very well at all. Mexico as well, not doing terribly really. But for now, Mexico will be the story of success over the coming half a decade, something like that. Just today, they're doing their first auctions to private companies ever. And so they're doing energy reform there and then opening up to private investment, international investment. So we should see Mexico over here in about half a decade's time. But for now, you can see all this supply growth is coming through from the United States and from Canada. And that is what has oversupplied the market. But the law of unintended consequences, we haven't had Keystone passed. I'm not going to make a judgment on that. I'm not a US citizen, and so I don't feel like I should comment on politics. But in terms of Keystone not getting passed, it meant that the oil has had to find its way around the country in other ways. So back in sort of 2010, we were shifting about 50,000 barrels a day of oil around the US by rail. Skip forward sort of 4 or 5 years now, after not having that pipeline built and having this real sort of boost in supply here, as we saw from the Van Halen, from the Saturday Night Fever chart, boom! Over 1 million barrels a day now of oil is traveling around the US by rail. And as you can see here, it's going across to the East Coast. It's pushing out all of those imports that are coming in from elsewhere. And so we're sending it over there. We're even sending it down to the Gulf. We're sending it off to California, all around the US. And so it's just interesting to see how not having this pipeline passed, what has happened. And so it really is changing the face of distribution, really, of oil around the US. In terms of winners and losers, taking more of a global look, the winners of the drop in the oil price are those countries that are importing it. The losers are the ones that are exporting it. And so, as you can see here, you basically got this huge kind of stimulus package going on, where Asia is seeing a boom of sort of 393 billion. This is on an annual basis, based on a sort of like a drop from $100 to $50. But this huge boom there, but all it's doing is seeing it transferred from the Middle East. So these huge producers, these petro countries that are reliant on these revenues, are basically giving those up for the benefit of Asia, etc. Canada getting hit as well. Norway, another country that is highly dependent upon oil revenues, but the US seeing a boost there. Europe as well. These countries that, yes, we may be the largest consumer of oil in the world, sort of 19, 20 million barrels a day, but as I mentioned, we are still importing so many of those needs still. Okay, what we will probably find in the coming years is that the greatest impact of what we've seen from Saudi Arabia and the price drop that we've seen in the last year is that a number of different longer-term projects are going to get cancelled. As I mentioned, oil production, well, oil demand is at sort of 93, 94 million barrels a day. Consumption the same. This year, we're going to see 1.2 million barrels a day of growth. Next year, we'll see 1.2 million barrels a day of growth. Just this ongoing demand growth coming through 94, 95, 96. You get the idea. But because of that, we need these different projects to come to fruition to meet those needs in 2017, 2018. And so this is just a snapshot showing that this isn't necessarily a localized thing. From Azerbaijan to Angola to Australia to Canada, these different projects are dependent upon a break-even of 65, 80, 70, 80, all prices that are well above where we are now. And so the likelihood is that we'll see a supply crunch potentially appearing sort of 2017, 2018, when we expect this oil to come to market as it always has done, and it doesn't. All right, one of the things, it's been a huge boom for the US economy, boom too, but I'll get into that in the next slide or two. But for other countries, they're not necessarily feeling the full benefit of the drop in oil prices because they've had subsidies in place. And it's really kind of a world gone mad when you have someone like Iran at the top there. You may have heard their name a couple of times in the last couple of days. But Iran spends 11.5% of its GDP on subsidizing oil to its people. It spends less than 4% of its GDP on education. And so what hopefully, and that's why I've got winning at the top there, that the fact that we've seen this price drop in oil, we're seeing these different subsidies unwound, not only here, but in terms of Pakistan, Indonesia, India, etc. And then hopefully they will invest that money instead in something as crazy as education. So there you go. But so here we are in the US, the rig count. It is just finally turning around now. I wasn't able to update this in time before getting this presentation in, but we're seeing the rig count bouncing. It's dropped sort of 60% from the high last October, just above 1,600. However, production is only just starting to level off now. Yes, there is that lagged relationship, but the key thing is that even though the rig count may drop by 60%, oil production will not drop by 60%. It will not drop by 6%. And basically, well, that's because of a shift towards what we're seeing is greater productivity. These guys, when oil's at $100 a barrel, it doesn't necessarily matter which part of their shale play they're drilling because they're going to be getting profit anyway. But what this chart is showing you is that at Permian Basin, so this is one of the key ones in Texas there, the brown line over on the right there. So basically out of a well, barrels per day is getting sort of 200 only sort of at the beginning of 2015, and now that has ramped up to over 300, basically a 50% increase of productivity from that well. And that's essentially why oil production is not dropping off here in the US, while the rig count has done. Key thing to remember as well is that sort of 70% of production comes from 30% of the wells. And so there's a lot at play here, but the key thing is that the US is very resilient and will keep on producing oil, and it is not going to by any means drop off precipitously. Okay, final slide here, just to bring it back to sort of the end user really. In terms of retail gasoline prices, the price of gasoline last year averaged about $3.50 a gallon on a national average. If you live in California, in Los Angeles, apparently it hit $5 today, which is highly unfortunate. But my key point about gasoline prices, because of the oil price drop that I mentioned, we've seen such a benefit to the US economy. We consume 378 million gallons of gasoline a day. That's 9 million barrels of gasoline a day here in the US, and actually it's gone up a bit this year because lower prices has spurred on demand. But so you take those 378 million gallons of gasoline, and we are $1 cheaper at the pump per gallon than we were this time last year, and we will be on the national average for this time versus last year. So basically we are receiving $378 million back in our pockets, we as the US population, versus last year. That accrues to about $150 billion of savings in terms of gasoline. Now, granted, there are downsides to the oil price drop, but the key thing is to remember, in terms of consumer spending, this has been a big boom for all of us guys, because that money is not necessarily all going back into the economy in terms of going to restaurants or that, but we're seeing some of it go there, we're seeing debt paid down, etc. And so this has been a good thing for the US economy. So that's just my final rant on oil. And with that, what we'll do is we'll go and have a quick tour around the energy landscape of the globe, actually. Just keeping the eye on time here. All right, so I love this slide. It's coal. This is probably not so great for Kentucky here in terms of the generation mix, but what we've seen in just the news had just come out in April for the first time ever in the US, the generation mix has the natural gas share of the generation mix has surpassed coal for the first time ever, going to 31% versus 30%. The key thing about this chart, though, for me, is that sort of 10 years ago, we were seeing coal was nearly 50% of the generation mix here in the US. Then what you saw is 2012, it got down to 37.4. At the time, that was a record low. And everyone was like, wow, aren't we being environmentally friendly? You know, we're not using coal as much. Hogwash, that wasn't true. The reason the coal dropped in the generation mix is because the price of natural gas dropped to a 10-year low. And so because of that, natural gas rose in the generation mix up to 30.3%. Then, as natural gas prices gradually rose, coal stole that share back and has then taken more of the generation mix. That said, the key takeaway now is that because of EPA rulings, what we're seeing is this switch away from coal and into natural gas. So going forward, the natural gas share of the generation mix is likely to be basically a parity going forward in the next few years. So 32, 33% with the natural gas piece there. And so really it is a bit of the I don't want to say the death knell of coal, because in sort of 2035, we're still going to be getting sort of 15%, something like that, of our entire energy from coal still, which is crazy to think that far in the future and think that's still happening. But that is basically the reality. Nuclear as well. Nuclear still accounts for sort of nearly 20% of the US generation mix. As you can see here, so Illinois is up at 50% there. 31 states in the US still use nuclear energy. And so it's something that just is kind of a stalwart and people have forgotten about. And we'll go into globally where we are seeing that sort of petering out to a certain extent, but here in the US it's still going relatively strongly. Natural gas is going to start stealing the share away from nuclear, but at a much slower incremental attempt compared to what we're seeing with coal. Okay, so in terms of natural gas, the Henry Hub price, it really has been a case of nat gas, flat gas here, because after the belly of the Great Recession, you know, which we saw there on our Van Halen charts, you can basically see that over here for oil, for natural gas. And if you plotted oil with this, you'd see that oil prices then started to increase, but natural gas prices have basically stayed flat ever since here, look. And the reason for that is basically because we suddenly discovered that we are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas, but we can't get it out of the country yet. And so, whereas, say, drilling in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago was about $7 an MMBTU break-even, the break-evens involved here are so much lower because you're doing the horizontal drilling, you're doing the hydraulic fracturing. It's just driven down the price of natural gas, driven down those break-evens, even though demand has continued to increase to a record. So that just continued along there. And even when we had the polar vortex here early last year, we still saw prices blip up to $6, and then it's come back down again, and we're sort of sub $3 now still. But another key reason as well for this low natural gas price has been because of the shale oil boom, which actually followed the natural gas boom that we saw here. And so the key things to focus on here is the Eagle Ford and the Permian. What we've seen there is, so as Eagle Ford in Texas there has ramped up production of oil, that is, you're seeing natural gas coming out as associated gas. They're going after the oil, but they're getting the gas out too. And so sort of 20–25% of total US gas production now is associated gas. It's basically an afterthought. So these guys are going after the oil because the oil price is that much higher. Again, natural gas is coming out. And so as long as the price of natural gas is, say, above zero, all of that is profit. And so that's what we're seeing here. And we just can't build out the infrastructure quick enough. You look at something like Bakken down the bottom here, that's in North Dakota. They still flare a third of their natural gas there just because they can't get the pipelines, the infrastructure, and the costing just isn't right there to get it out of that state. If it was a country, it'd be like the 5th most flared country in the world. You can see those satellite images. You know when you see like one of North Korea and South Korea is all lit up at night and North Korea is like dark. When you look at North Dakota, you can see it there too in the same sort of fashion where it's just these flares are lit up. So really quite crazy there. But as long as the oil boom continues in the US, you'll continue to see this natural gas coming to market as an afterthought. But as I mentioned, we're the Saudi Arabia of natural gas, but we can't get it out of the country yet. But we are going to be seeing it starting at the end of this year into next year. These are all actually import terminals. But what we're seeing is they're being retrofitted to export natural gas. Sorry about that. And so this is going to be sending natural gas predominantly off to Asia. Asia accounts for 75% of the global LNG market. And so what the logic behind this is that if the US has so much gas here, they should just send it out to these places which are willing to pay far more money for it. So what we're going to be seeing is places like Sabine, past there, Freeport, Lake Charles, Cove Point. By the end of 2019, we're going to be seeing a good amount, as much as some 9 BCF a day leaving the US in terms of natural gas exports. The reason natural gas exports are so conducive for being sent abroad is because they're 600 times more dense as a liquid than they are as a gas. And granted, you have to freeze it to like minus 250 degrees, but then you pop it into one of these things and then send it across the ocean there. Whenever I see this picture, I always think of a James Bond movie, and I think, wouldn't it be amazing to have, like, at the end of a James Bond movie, there's like the big shootout at the end, there's the baddies, and there's Daniel Craig, and then boom, because you can bet that thing will go up like anything. It's surely pretty flammable, but There you go. Maybe that's just me as well. All right, moving swiftly on. Okay, this is a very, very hectic chart here, but it's just to explain the prices in terms of global natural gas and the link to oil. As I mentioned, all paths lead back to energy, but also oil. There's such a far-reaching effect of oil in terms of what it is used in and how prices are derived generally for other commodities. So you can see us here. There's a US natural gas price down here, which is the red line. The black line at the top there is Brent, and so you see it absolutely tanking last year as Saudi Arabia started just putting oil onto the market. But the key thing is that when the US is thinking about exporting, it's looking at those Asian prices, the blue line there, and you can see those up at sort of $10, whereas the US price here is around sort of $3. And so as long as those transportation costs involved there are around $6, which they kind of are across to Asia there, then that makes it sort of conducive to send it across there. So as I mentioned, 75% of LNG market is in Asia. Japan accounts for like 35% of the global market. Essentially what happened was the nuclear disaster at Fukushima there in early 2011. Basically prior to that they were getting a third of their needs from nuclear, and then after that they sequentially took their sort of 50-odd reactors offline and then needed to replace them with something because Japan has no natural resources to speak of. And so it relies on, so it basically has since relied on LNG, and so that's why the price is so high. The one thing they do as well is link the price to oil, and so your price for LNG predominantly in Asia, and also about half of it in long-term contracts in Europe as well, is linked to that price of oil. And so as long as the oil price stays relatively higher than that natural gas price, say like where we are, you will see cargoes attracted across there. So the LNG market is absolutely fascinating, and we'll see a lot more of that to come as the US starts to export oil, export gas. I'm not sure if we'll export oil yet, but key thing to remember though, we're not going to see our price of natural gas double or anything like that, and if we do, we should see like the administration lynched on that for doing it. But the key thing is, what you're going to see is a demand response if we do see prices rise, because we've seen so much gas coming through as an afterthought. When you actually start to focus on that gas, if the break-even is more of a $3.50 or a $4 than a $2.50, then it will bring prices back down again. And so I think the supply situation for natural gas in the US is relatively strong. So in different countries, they have different tax, and so like tactics. So here in the US, we're seeing a focus on this natural gas as the bridge fuel to an energy future, as they call it. And so what it is, I want to just highlight here, is that even though we're seeing a lot of wind generation coming online, this is for this year in terms of capacity additions, we're seeing a bit of that coal vilification going on here too. But what you are seeing is 3 times as much natural gas capacity being added versus solar. There's just this focus on natural gas as opposed to renewables as much. That's not to say that there's not going to be a huge renewable boom, across various pockets of the US. In terms of California, California is targeting sort of 33% renewables by 2020, and it will get there. It's going to target 50% renewables by 2030, and it will likely get there too. Just because there's such a focus on it, and it is sort of conducive for solar and for wind, etc. But if I show you this is a different tack, and so this has been done by Germany. And now I know across on the left there they kind of look like candy corns, but what this is basically the generation mix of Germany. So once, as I mentioned about Japan with the nuclear disaster over there, right when that happened, Germany came out and said, boom, we're going to do the same thing. We're not using nuclear, we're going to take it offline by 2022. And so that has been its plan. But instead of focusing on natural gas as the bridge fuel to an energy bridge fuel to an energy future? Yes, that is right. What it's doing instead is focusing on renewables as a bridge fuel to a renewable future. So it's gone after, the yellow is solar, and then the blue is wind. And, but then the rest here is coal, unfortunately. And so key thing is to remember that on certain days, and this is true, in certain days, on weekends, on low demand days in Germany, they can get sort of 75–80% of their generation needs from renewables. Isn't that absolutely amazing? Like the leading economy of Europe is like purely basically reliant on solar energy. But the problem with that is is that there's a certain week in December where there won't be any sun and there won't be any wind, and then they have to rely on something else. And so as we looked at our coal back on 2012, when we saw the generation mix drop so much, we had record exports for coal that year, sort of 112 million tons of coal we exported, and we were sending them across to Germany because basically they needed them as base load. And so it's kind of a world gone mad in that they do seem to be doing the right thing by pursuing renewables, but it's not necessarily working out. They're having negative power prices on weekends as well sometimes, because when it's super sunny and super windy, then they have too much energy, and they're pushing it out to other countries, just saying, please, can you buy this off? Please, we'll give you money for you to take it off our hands. And so it seems that you can never win, unfortunately. And so, as I mentioned, in terms of California, solar coming through, the little dot there shows you in 2014, California got 5% of its generation needs from solar. North Carolina as well is launching a real effort there in terms of renewable fuel standards. And so we are seeing solar coming through, but just not at the same pace necessarily as we are seeing in other countries. In terms of Texas, wind power, that's what they're focusing on there. Partly because the upfront costs are somewhat cheaper, and the subsidies just tilted that way, but also just because it's sort of more proven. I think that the one downside of solar is that people are like, well, yeah, it was so cheap. It's cheap now, but it was more expensive 2 years ago. But in 2 years' time, why don't we just hold on, because it's going to be that much cheaper still? And so we're just not seeing the full implementation of it. But Texas there gets 10.6% of its generation needs from wind, and that will only continue to grow in the coming years, and so a really great tactic. The only thing with wind, like as I mentioned with solar, there's certain times when it's not sunny, as we well know here. But yeah, March to June accounts for 40% of its annual generation. That's the one main downside, I suppose, for renewables until we get batteries, is that you can't tell when that time is going to be, when you're going to get that energy. You're just going to get it now because it's windy. So, but believe it or not, the leading energy source, or the leading source of generation in the US by 2050 is reported to be wind generation. Isn't that crazy? Do you think that's crazy? I think it is. I thought there'd be much more focus on solar, but while on a global basis we may see solar take the lead in terms of the generation mix by the middle of this century, the likelihood is that, according to the EIA at least, there will be a 35% in terms of wind generation by then, which is really quite amazing to me. Okay, so just to wrap up, final slide. So we've looked at all these different things here. You know, we did the economy, we looked at oil, and then we've gone through sort of coal to nuclear to natural gas to solar to wind. But the key thing of the boom that we've seen here in the US is that in a few short years, we have gone from being sort of 70% self-sufficient all the way up to nearly 90% because of the coal, because of the US oil boom, the natural gas boom, and the coal that we're still producing, just to a lesser extent there. And so we are in a great situation compared to where we were just a decade ago. And even though we haven't felt the full benefit of that the lower oil prices until recently, perhaps in the last year, we've been feeling the benefit as a US country for a number of years of those low natural gas prices. And that is a very good thing indeed. And so please do not take that lightly. But with that, I'll open it up for questions. We've got a few minutes, but thank you very much for listening to me rant at you for 40 minutes.
Any questions? Jason.
That was an excellent overview. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Very entertaining presentation. I just want to take one issue with some of the assumptions on renewables. I realize you're using EIA projections, but you know, in California's model, cost doesn't matter. So yes, they may achieve their goals, but you know, what cost to California? I don't think they really care about that. But, I guess my question is, you know, what assumptions are baked into those EIA models? Do they continue the subsidies and mandates and the current regulatory environment? Because if you talk to utility executives and industrial customers and others, renewables don't exist but for government mandates and subsidies. And so if your industry exists by government fiat, isn't it equal